me. I've been mulling over your letters about art, or as Yeats had it, we descant and yet again descant upon the supreme theme of art and song. I have to admit, I didn't think I had anything further to say about any of this, or that I might even be interested in joining the issue if it were raised in my presence. All that seems so long ago about art, so infused with late into the night bull sessions, with such passionate intensity, so filled with the seriousness of theory, all the Sturm und Drang of heady undergraduate days and all that. However, much of what you've said has intrigued and instructed me, as always. First, that art partakes of the sacred. Second, dialogue is essential between those who have done and those who are about to do art. Third, art is magic which transforms. Fourth, the art of art is manifested in that moment our imaginations say, wow. That last is likely what actually got me up off my sagging duff, because though I may have thought of something of the kind before, I hadn't thought of it as such, and it's an intriguing idea. If I understand you, it's that the piece of art, the painting or sculpture or poem or music, is simply a delivery service, and that the art itself is in whatever recognition gets zapped into our lives as a result of something in us having been moved to fail, touched to experience, or led to understand. Another way of thinking about that is to say that facts alone don't necessarily mean a thing until touched by the value and quality of human experience. Like Michelangelo's vibrant God in the Sistine Chapel, stretching himself toward the passive atom to charge him into life with the awesome shock of humanity. I also thought of what Robert Frost said about poetry, that the poetry of a poem is what can't be translated into another language. My own way of thinking that has been in the image of the radium stain in the bottom of the Curie's Petri dish after they had boiled down tons and tons of pitch blende. Still, though excited about the concept that the art of art resides in the moment of its effect on a given person rather than in anything intrinsic to the thing itself, there still remain gradations of competence in creating art. While it is surely true that not all people will get their jollies by looking at a work by Hopper, Rodin, or Picasso, or reading Faulkner, Mann, or Shakespeare, or listening to Yo-Yo Ma play Bach's suites for solo cello, there has to be something in the thing itself that can spark a powerful and meaning response in someone. Another image, this from my past as a radio man in the Army, might make sense here. If you're going to get a message from here to there, you've got to have both a transmitter and a receiver. Yeah, which means both radios as hardware have to be in good working order, and the radio men, as users of the hardware, have to have good fists to send and good ears to receive, have to know the Morse code, the correct radio procedures, how to operate the M209 converter for coding, decoding, etc. This, of course, does not suggest that there is no serendipity. We sometimes were affected by atmospheric conditions over which we had no control. So, as Henry James said, there is good writing and there is bad writing. The obvious corollary, there are good readers and there are bad readers. A good reader may well get something fine from a bad book, but a bad reader will seldom get anything fine from a good one. Still on this business of where the art resides, I have to suggest what might be a demurrer. I am basically a formalist. I like process, order, and intent. I sensed a suggestion in something you said that art is a swinging, free-form sort of thing without obligations to the past or concern for the future. I know you didn't actually say that, so this is mainly just an extension of this whole messy subject. I think back to classes I've taught and remember loving to teach Dylan Thomas's "Do Not Go Gentle into That Dark Night." Many of you may know it well. Because it's so wild and swinging and free, yet it's a villanelle for all that. So I always love to talk about form and how even the most seemingly restrictive forms still could carry the burden of passion and the sense of breaking out. Or Browning's Fra Lippo Lippi, that dramatic monologue you can be halfway through before it hits you that it's written in those terribly restrictive couplets. But his use of the run-on lines hides that. Perhaps Michelangelo's young slave breaking away from the clutch of marble slabs. Well, all that requires an artist to have an understanding of form, a willingness to use it, the whimsy to see how far it can be bent, the discipline to work it until it comes as close as he'll ever get to what he sees so clearly in his head, and the intelligence to know when he's on to something worth the effort and when he's not. Your second point next, the dialogue business. Think of Faulkner and Phil Stone, the fugitive poets' meetings in Nashville, Tennessee. Plato and Socrates, Ben Jonson and everybody else around at the time, Hemingway and Stein and Fitzgerald in Paris, students and teachers in formal classroom settings. To that, you can add Henry James's prefaces to his novels, E.M. Forster's Aspects of the Novel, T.S. Eliot's On Poetry and Poets, Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. There's seemingly no end to such a list, and all the books mentioned here are conversations by writers with other writers or wannabes. Thinking back to my own times of intense conversational discourse with other writers, I don't know that I was ever convinced, especially by the efficacy of their arguments, but as with any such meetings, what was sharpened was my own ideas about whatever specifics we happened to be dealing with on any given occasion. So often then, what writers or any artists are doing when they talk to each other is justifying through argumentation their own activities. We tend to use whatever hold on logic and persuasion we may have to justify how we're spending our time. Our fellows, in turn, invariably point out how we're wasting our time in following old, worn-out paths, persisting in passé media, bothering still with dated forms or stale theories or long ago disproved or merely dismissed assumptions. Interestingly, we all tended to be right quite as much as we tended to be wrong. This conversation business easily slides into other realms, though that's the nature of conversation. And where it's sliding right now is into the danger of spending too much time with the cutting edge folks, those who always know the latest trend, the most recent fad, the most brilliant up-and-coming young genius, the presumably obvious direction things are heading, and so on. Beware, oh, take care, lest we lose that most essential spark of ourselves and spend our lives always chasing the next chimera someone else has convinced us is the way to go. Art, Picasso often gets quoted as saying, is a lie that tells the truth. But Picasso's truth doesn't have to be John Acorn's truth. Segovia's truth doesn't have to be Marc Regnier's truth. R.V. Castle's truth doesn't have to be Bob Sorrells' truth. So what the learner, writer, poet, painter, printmaker, potter, glassblower has to learn from those older and more experienced heads is not what to do, and certainly not do as I do, but listen to yourself. Hemingway talked about his built-in baloney detector. You know what? Yeah, listen to your own. Faulkner talked about the old verities of the human heart. Listen to that too. Pope wrote, "Fool, look into thy heart and write." And Rilke, well, Rilke is worth quoting at even greater length. Go into yourself, he said. Find out the reason that commands you to write. This most of all, ask yourself in the most silent hour of your night, must I write? Then, as if no one had ever tried before, try to say what you see and feel and love and lose. Lose. We pay not only for our failures, but for our successes as well. But leave the art to what happens when scales fall and ears open and the magic of the words transforms, you wrote. I think this says more with less quite well, and it comes in the context of not really being able to gather and collect art. So we're now into the magic which transforms. Magic is an interesting word to use too, because it takes on the mean of trickery, pulling rabbits out of a hat, of sawing people in half, only to have them reappear whole, of knowing exactly which card you have pulled from the deck, of making someone disappear in a whoof of smoke before your very eyes. Magic. But magic is always explainable. In all our conversations, as I was suggesting above, what could we expect to learn from Picasso about drawing? He might as well say, echoing U.S. Army field manuals, grasp the charcoal with your right thumb and forefinger, and with a smart snap of your wrist, strike the charcoal's flat edge against the face of the already prepared newsprint. He would be telling us something all right, something useful, in fact. We do need folks to tell us how to do things, but would it be what we were asking about? At one point in Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales, the narrator is cataloging his useful presents, among them a book that told me everything about the wasp except why. Then there's the magic of transformation. When it comes, something happens to us, and there's no accounting for why it happens. I always think that it must be because we are ready to be happened to, so to speak. We are, for whatever reasons, finely tuned or attuned receivers, not only soaking up the signals floating through the ethers of the universe, but understanding them as well. But as soon as I say that, I take it back, partly because there are also times when we know that something has broadsided us, but we haven't a clue what in the world it is. All we know is that we are changed, that some new standard perhaps has been set for us, that we can't ever see the world, or at least portions of it, in quite the same way again, that we have been touched by the ineffable and now know something so mysterious we don't even know what it is we know. It doesn't have to be a complete Brahms symphony or a novel by Tolstoy. It may be simply a brief phrase from a piece of music or an image from a poem of some quick stab of insight that may flit away as quickly as it came. And even if we forget what it was we knew, we still retain the knowledge of our having known it for even so teasingly and maddeningly finite a time. Albert Camus wrote, "On certain mornings as we turn a corner, an exquisite dew falls on our heart and then vanishes, but the freshness lingers, and this always is what the heart needs." A stain in the bottom of a petri dish, the music still felt after it was heard no more, as a hymn put it. I write on these spindrift pages for the lovers, their arms round the griefs of the ages, wrote Dylan Thomas. I can only give examples. When I rounded a corner of the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York, and suddenly saw Hopper's painting entitled Gas, I was stunned. Was it the red pump so blatant against the dark green of the trees behind? Sudden, unrooted, non-specific memories from my childhood reacting to the Flying Horse logo of Mobil Gas? I have no idea. And also Hopper's Nighthawks. I knew those people in that cafe in the middle of the night, taking their coffee together or apart, lonely or alone. no matter. And there's no end of music either. Virtually any version of Amazing Grace, virtually any form of Barbara's Adagio, the final duet of L'Aida of Arvo Part, and certainly including Vernon Dalhart singing the Prisoner's Song, Hank Williams, I'm So Lonesome I Could Die, and Willie Nelson, Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain, and of course nearly anybody on Will That Sword Be Unbroken? Yeah. Magic. Once in a panel discussion, the novelist E.L. Doctorow said, the point about any art, I feel, where my own sentimentality comes in, is that it's made out of nothing. I don't know, some paints in a tube, a few reams of paper, a kid with a guitar, a piece of stone. Made out of nothing. A couple of paragraphs back, I used the word mysterious. I like the word magic, but I also respond to mystery, and certainly it works here as a pretty neat segue into my first point, art as partaking of the sacred. Now, you disassociate art from art forms where you talk about this, and I still wonder how to do that. Still hear Yeats asking, how can we know the dancer from the dance? A little more context might help there. Oh, chestnut tree, great-rooted blossomer, are you the leaf, the blossom, or the bowl? Oh, body swayed to music, oh, brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance? As a current wag put his spin on an old question, if a man says something in a remote forest, is it still wrong even if his wife's not around to hear it? These cone-like questions are intended to be futile, I think, except that they may indicate the limits of logic while expanding the possibilities of intuitive responses and connections. Now, having said this, I can talk directly about mystery and the sacred. In Among School Children, Yeats is getting around to the question of ultimate reality on all that. Do we experience life through action or through being? Or is it in both? Or is it whatever? In the penultimate stanza to Among School Children, Yeats draws a parallel between nuns and mothers, both of whom worship images, but how those images are different. The nuns keeping a marble or a bronze repose, as opposed to the mother's reveries. But both, he says, break hearts. For most people, that which is sacred is that which we worship. But in conventional attitudes toward the sacred, it would be considered idolatrous to worship something other than a or the God. So how literal can we get in this sort of discussion? I assume there is no need to equate the sacred with any specific religion or habit of worship. As for myself, I seem to be drawn toward mystics of various sorts, and though I have hardly spent a lifetime in deep study, still what I have read leads me to conclude that in many ways they tend to be saying much the same thing. Find God. Wonderfully enough, they all seem to agree more or less that there is no single path to that fulfillment. One way or another, they all seem to be saying that the ways are many and we must all find and then follow that way or path which leads us to God, that mystery known only when known. Christian, Buddhist, and Hindu mystics would seem to have more in common with each other than mainline Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists have. And you speak of art as illumination, a kind of revelation, if you please. When I read that, I thought again about Browning and his Fra Lippo Lippi, where the good friar tells the night watch, we're made so that we love first when we see them painted, things we have passed, perhaps 100 times nor cared to see. Right after that, he continues, art was given for that. God uses us, painters, to help each other so, lending our minds out. Maybe that's what all artists are for, to lend their minds out. And if they do it well enough, and if we allow them those roles as teacher, interpreter, sage, visionary by paying attention to their work, then perhaps they are functioning as messengers of God and are as worthy to be heeded as any other kind. For I do believe that in my Father's house are many mansions, as John reports the word of Jesus. But back to worship, which may or may not involve a religion. I may be more comfortable talking about worshipfulness. I hope that lets me pass into the realm of spirituality, because I want to be a spiritual person and think I am one, or at least have a spiritual sensibility. About Jesus, for instance, some 400 years ago, one of our religious forebears in Transylvania, Francis David, who remained a Unitarian rather than a Trinitarian, got it? Held to this about Jesus: serviam non adoramus. Serve, but do not adore. That makes sense to me. Jesus is a spiritual leader, one through whom God may well speak, but not himself God. The question of spirituality versus reason can get pretty murky, but we spirituality people simply accept that there is something else, while rationalists seem to get nervous when things can't be precisely quantified. There's a lot of each in my own nature, which is closer to the kind of stuff Margaret Fuller and Ralph Waldo Emerson talked and corresponded about for so long. Apparently, Fuller kept leaning against Emerson to move him away from the abstract and theoretical idealism he felt comfortable with toward biographical idealism, which involved an idealism that is concerned with ideas only as they can be lived, with laws only as they can be seen in events, with the word only when it becomes flesh, with the spirit only as it animates the material. Dr. Rowe's art being made out of nothing, your art as something that illuminates. Fuller's insisting that idealism is pointless without some form of action to manifest it. All this along with Emerson's statement that man is the point wherein matter and spirit meet and marry, all come together in a wondrously mad jumble in my head. Perhaps art becomes when the idea and its realization meet in a person's head or heart or spirit, or even hits him quite physically. Barry Moser was an engraver who had spent a good bit of time apparently doing scenes from the Bible. He said he wasn't a religious man in an institutional sense, but clearly he understands something about good and evil, mystery and agony. Religion and art, he said, seek to make some sort of order out of chaos. Then he said his work was his prayer, that falling away of the scales you talk about is the same as the epiphanal gasp when one realizes that he believes. What I felt when I saw the Hoppers, or felt Rodolfo's wrenching loss of Mimi at the end of La Boheme, was essentially the same as what I felt once after reading a passage from a speech by Robert Bellah, sociologist. A sense of understanding what Christianity was really all about, and nearly converting on the spot myself because I understood something more about what love was, or at least how it could be perceived. You said to me once that you didn't know anything about God. I allowed as how no one did, but in a traditional plain chant, there is the line, ubi caritas et amor, Deus ibi est. Where there is charity and love, God is there. My responses to art tend to be much the same. As the sacred requires that which is sacred, art requires that which is art. That is, we know God when we are in the sacred presence. We know art the same way when we feel its presence. In both cases, not only are we transfixed, staring and believing disbelief, but if you're asleep, wake up at this point. Like a maiden who is struck suddenly by the purity of her felt lust, when she is in the presence of the one who she intuitively knows will be the one to teach her what human love is, and feels the need to look away at least for a moment until she can compose herself. We must be ready ourselves so that we can accept that power should it possess us. There is a moment of absolute quiet, a stillness, a stasis during which our hearts, our minds, our souls, our most fleshly bodies are at one with everything, when all mysteries are understood, even if only for a nanosecond. It is ineffable. It is all the mystery of that which is experienced, not understood. I'll give the final word here to old Emerson. Trust yourself, he said. Trust the instinct to the end, though you cannot tell why or see why.